Hey gang, Luke here. Just wanted to note that we recorded this special extra episode on Monday evening, Australian time, before we knew the outcome of the US election. The three of us, no doubt like all of you, are still processing what the election result means for climate and energy policy, both globally and at home in Australia. And there is no doubt that we will be picking up that thread on our next episode, which we're recording on the ground at COP29 in Baku. But in the meantime, I hope you can enjoy this conversation from earlier this week, in which Tennant is just happy about CBAMs. This is Let Me Sum Up, Australia's premier carbon border adjustment podcast. I'm Luke Menzel, recording on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined today by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, Luke and Tennant. I'm in the unenviable position of standing between Tennant and a conversation on CBAM tonight. So I'm not going to derail us with a T-shirt chat, as we just discussed. I think I'm just going to put Tennant out of his misery so we can jump straight into it.
A position even more dangerous than standing between a premier and a bucket of money, Frankie.
That's right. I wouldn't recommend.
And we are, of course, also joined by a man who displayed saintly patience as he waited for the long-delayed carbon leakage review consultation paper, endured the ridicule and derision of his co-hosts with a quiet dignity, and who is now enjoying the last laugh as the timing of the paper's release has necessitated a special extra episode of this podcast exclusively focused on his pet topic. That man, of course, is Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Hello. I'm having a lovely time. The worm has turned. The day of the CBAM has arrived, or at least a day. There will be many more days and many more steps in this process. But I'm feeling like everything's looking up just about now.
Everything's coming up, Reid.
Sleeping well for the first time in months.
On this week's show, it is Border Adjustment A-Go-Go as we dig deep into the long-awaited second carbon leakage review consultation paper released last Friday afternoon as we record. This review, commissioned by the Albanese government and led by Professor Frank Iozzo, has examined the risk of carbon leakage, in which emissions reduction policies at home result in the offshoring of carbon-intensive production processes instead of a transition to lower emission technologies. And importantly, for the CBAM enthusiasts on this podcast, the review has also considered the role of a carbon border adjustment mechanism and what it could do in lowering the risk of carbon leakage for Australia. Tennant, you have been waiting for this conversation for months, if not years. So, Frankie, what did you make of this paper?
Brilliant.
Are you really going to do that to him? No.
You can handball if you want, Frankie.
Well, we didn't plan this. Here I was getting so comfy and settled back into my chair for a half-hour oration. Like, I have thoughts, but I feel like this is Tennant's one to lead off with tonight.
Well, why don't I set up some basics, and then you guys can bring like actual human comprehension vibes to this rather than the like swivel-eyed obsession that I exude from every pore. So this is in some ways a funny paper to be doing because it's a very intermediate product. It comes after an issues paper that sort of said a lot more than carbon leakage, what do you reckon, but set up the issues for people to respond to. It comes before major recommendations, which is still aimed for by the end of this year. There's going to be a month for people to get feedback in on this paper, and then less than a month for the people at the Carbon Leakage Review, including Frank Iozzo, to emerge from suspended animation and act on that feedback. And it comes after, of course, the increasingly or ever less cryptic references to maybe a carbon border adjustment mechanism in the various stages of consideration of the reforms to the safeguard mechanism in 2022 and 2023. And then if this should all lead to something, of course, there's further processes to come on actually designing and implementing something. So we're sort of coming in the middle of the movie. But to stretch that metaphor, this is sort of the Empire Strikes Back of coming in at the middle rather than some, I would say, some baffling art movie where you have, well, like a David Lynch movie, which I love, but they're very baffling. This paper sets out how big a deal is carbon leakage, what are the options for dealing with it, and how do they look according to the review, and what ought we to look at further. And they're hanging out that shingle for people to throw roses at, or maybe rotten tomatoes, but probably roses. Carbon leakage is the fear that because there's a messy world and uneven climate policies between countries, that industry is going to relocate from jurisdictions with stronger climate policies to those with weaker climate policies. And that's a fear that's been very potent in climate over the last couple of decades. It's been part of the case for not having climate policy at all, and it's been a fear that's sought to be dealt with things like freely allocating emissions rights to sensitive industries, or giving them baselines, or giving them a system where the baselines can decline more slowly if they're really, really seriously impacted. And so this is looking at that issue and saying, yeah, there is still an issue with carbon leakage risks. There's a lot in the safeguard reforms to try to avert that. Those efforts are pretty effective for a while, but for some activities, and they particularly nominate things associated with the manufacture of cement, clinker and lime going into cement, and some other activities like ammonia, steel, though they say it's complicated, pulp and paper, and some glass-related activities. They think there is a risk there that's worth doing something more about. The current measures don't last that well. They've looked at alternatives including public spending, international agreements, product standards, and border carbon adjustments. They rigorously don't say CBAM, or Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, in this paper.
Was that just to annoy you, Tennant?
So, no, it was not, surprisingly enough. I think it's because a lot of people associate CBAM not with the broad concept of CBAMs, but with the specific CBAM that Europe is proposing. And a bunch of countries have decided that they're very annoyed about that policy. And the review's theory is if you don't call it exactly that, people will be easier to persuade that it isn't exactly that, and they'll form a fresh view. So they're calling it border carbon adjustment. I don't know if you want to play along with that. You could call it BOCA if you wanted. I don't know if BOCA will be catching on, or if people will just be saying CBAM.
I listened back to the episode of the First Fuel podcast on which I interviewed you about your 2021 paper on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and in which you describe your ill-fated attempt to convince your colleagues at AI Group to call that paper CBAM.
Yeah. Well, the universe of subtitles for that paper ended up mostly being about ways of saying, don't worry, be happy, this is going to be fine. And CBAM was somewhat at odds with that.
Wasn't the subtitle "This Won't Hurt a Bit" or something like that?
That was one of the options. And that is a sentiment that pops up quite a few times in this paper. They are heading towards a recommendation that Australia adopt a border carbon adjustment or a carbon border adjustment. And they include in the argumentation for that some quantitative analysis which, I mean, there's ins and there's outs to it, but it basically contextualizes all this as a much smaller deal than many people may think. That it has vanishingly small impacts on the macroeconomy, very small impacts within industry subsectors, and teensy tiny, barely detectable impacts on product prices, especially products that people actually wind up buying rather than intermediate or material goods that are embodied in subsequent products. So there's a lot of calming of horses here, and I don't know, how calm did you feel after reading this paper?
I enjoy this paper a lot, and it, I think, does a really good job for someone that doesn't have a background in trade policy of kind of stepping through the ins and outs of how carbon leakage risk manifests itself in different parts of the Australian economy. I think it's important to say there's a couple of big types of carbon leakage risk. There's domestic producers, situations where domestic producers face a carbon price via the safeguard mechanism, competing with imports from countries that don't face an equivalent carbon charge. So the proposed carbon border adjustment would deal with this by placing a charge on imports that is equivalent to those faced by domestic producers, levelling the playing field. Of course, there's another big type of leakage risk, Australian exporters that are facing a carbon charge competing internationally with other producers that aren't. And while it would, the review says, be theoretically possible to deal with this issue by adjusting the carbon charge when exporting it to equalise it with the destination country, so basically rebate the carbon charge, like nobody's really proposing to do this because it would basically render the carbon charges imposed by mechanisms like the safeguard mechanism largely toothless. So it seems that what's being proposed is very much focused on levelling the playing field domestically rather than internationally.
I want to come back to the export thing because that was one that I seized on, and I wouldn't mind a bit of discussion around.
Love to.
But just to round out your point there, Luke, the other form of leakage they talk about is investment as well. So you talked about the two different trade channels, import and export, but they also talk about this risk of investment leakage where current or future policy differences can lead to investments that might shift towards different countries with less stringent policies. So, setting up of industries elsewhere and things like that. So they've definitely got an eye to that type of leakage in this review as well. And it was interesting to see which of the types of leakage kind of became more prevalent in their assessment. I agree with you at a high level, though. I thought it was a brilliantly written paper. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's something about just a very well written, in plain English, no flowery language, like actually just cut straight to the point, mostly throughout. That's just very pleasing to someone who has to read a lot of these. Well done, Boca team, into Q and Frank Yotz. I thought it was a really great paper to read. So I get the argument at that sort of high level about disagreeing with export rebates. My question really goes to governments throw money in all kinds of ways at these, at companies, at streams of investment, at different products to give Australia a competitive advantage. And I guess I'm not suggesting that public investment is a thing that can and should be just sustained at a really high level when sort of thinking about that. But I just wondered if demonising that kind of mechanism when in fact, like, we're actually paying a bunch of money, like you're just calling it something else effectively and you're handing over a bunch of money to companies to make them more competitive anyway. I guess I didn't really see the nitty-gritty analysis of why they were completely opposed to the idea of export rebates and where there might be some situations in which that could be advantageous down the track. It stuck out to me in reading the paper.
So I have really strong views about this because I'm a swivel-eyed obsessive. But to give the review authors their due, they do have a couple of pretty good answers for, if not border adjustment on exports, then what? Mm-hmm. And the things they point to are, well, one of the key activities that's not suitable in their view for an Australian border adjustment is aluminium and alumina because it's mostly exported. And they don't think an export adjustment is appropriate, but they do think, that potential green metals investment incentives through Future Made in Australia are a relevant thing there, which, as you were saying, Frankie, is a version of throwing money at them to make the transition. The other thing they say is the more markets worldwide that do inward adjustments that have a carbon price of their own and then a border adjustment of their own, that creates markets where it will be to your advantage to have lower emissions intensity. You'll be more profitable selling into a market with that adjustment than you would without it, and that is the prospect they offer or hope for sectors like aluminium. It is sort of totally out of the Australian government's control whether that happens or not. We can like barrack a bit and offer some friendship and collaboration for countries that want to go down that path. It would be a big deal if Japan or Korea or China did adjustments of that sort. And I'm sure there would be a lot of argy-bargy, but that's their answer. And then I could go on for about half an hour about why I think they're not correct that it's a really bad idea to do an export adjustment. But the shortest possible version of it is, well, we are already shielding exports from the bulk of their carbon costs. It's called a baseline. And they make that called or that assessment in other respects of this paper. It's just it's still the same thing whether you're doing it on the basis that it's just for all production in Australia or if it was only for the exported fraction of production. And legally, like you're right, lots of governments do throw all kinds of money at manufacturing of things that they think are strategic. And it's hard to see why an export carbon rebate or partial rebate would be any more destructive or undermining of competitors than production subsidies or very favourable tax rates or whatever else.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm going to win that argument.
No, well, I mean,
even though I should.
Well, I think you've just sort of seized on my observation there. Like in the world in which we, occupy now with IRA, hurricanes of carrots going on still in the US, we'll see in a couple of days' time. And things like Future Made in Australia here. Yeah, I didn't understand the rationale for such a, sort of strongly held objection over that kind of measure when we're basically doing it in other ways.
It is true that trade people hate it.
Yeah.
They hate the idea, and it's beyond what the EU have done. And so if Australia is going to take a step into this arena, we probably don't want to do anything that the EU hasn't already done, even though this is a BOCA, not a CBAM.
Well, maybe that answers my question, which I was going to pose to you, which is that why, if that's the case, if this is contestable, they state so categorically that it would likely be non-compliant with WTO rules. Maybe that's a very trade expert view of this mechanism, and it sounds to me like what you're saying, Tennant, is it hasn't actually been tested.
It has not, and so it is in the realm of trade professionals and bush lawyers to opine expansively. But it certainly would drive some people crazy to there are people who have a profound ick factor with any concept of border adjustment at all, and maybe those people are challenged enough by the import angle without having a world-leading fight about the export angle. I can be objective enough to see some logic in that.
Yeah. And I agree with the other point that they've made about sort of competing on equal footing or favourable footing if other countries are introducing their own mechanisms and import measures as well. But for the countries that are significant for us in terms of our exports, like you just rattled off a few, they're not on the list of countries that have, like either already doing CBAMs or kind of actively looking at it. The question I had for you, CBAM Guru, was whether there is any kind of nascent consideration or discussion of that kind, like of a carbon border adjustment mechanism from China, Japan, Korea, etc.
So Japan had a look at CBAM-related issues a couple of years back, at a time when they were looking at a broader set of should Japan adopt more aggressive carbon pricing policies domestically. And at that time, they reached the conclusion that they didn't like CBAM. Mostly from a not liking others doing it point of view. They've wound up being relatively dovish in practice, and there was feedback to the Australian carbon leakage review from a bunch of Japanese-based businesses who actually were largely saying, if you're going to do this, then please talk to us very, very closely so that you understand our situation, rather than saying, wrong way, go back, don't do this, which is more positive than I had expected. I think it is plausible, though, that Japan and Korea, which has a more aggressive emissions trading system, and China, which has recently decided to expand its national emissions trading system to include a bunch of industrial sectors that are very, very CBAM relevant, they are going to confront actually the same policy challenges that Europe and the United Kingdom and Australia are, which is that as you really get serious about ratcheting down the total allowed emissions or the intensity of the carbon constraint, then you start to reach the limit of what you can do to shield sensitive industries through free allocation of emissions rights, because there just ain't enough emissions rights left to satisfy all needs. You need to find a different way. And I don't know, I mean, the hurricane of carrots is one option, but fiscal policy faces limits too in different countries at different times. And so that leads you, even if you are currently a country that feels like it's disadvantaged by others' border adjustments, to considering a border adjustment of your own.
The other thing I was really impressed by in this paper was just the kind of like subsectoral analysis, going through all these different emissions intensive industrial sectors and detailed analysis of the risk of carbon leakage that applied to all of them. And there's a big range once you get into the detail. They're looking at the extent of carbon leakage risk. They looked at the practical feasibility of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Something that was really interesting is the degree to which domestic production is subject to safeguard obligations and the complexity that's introduced if some production is subject to safeguard obligations and other production isn't, just because of the size of the facilities and the spread of the size of the facilities within particular subsectors. And then, in different sectors, there's a range of other interacting policies and market conditions that may affect carbon leakage risk. And that plays into the suitability of a border carbon adjustment, as they call it. And so this is actually, when you get into the guts of the paper, a really nuanced analysis of the degree to which this mechanism makes sense in the near term for some sectors, possibly in the medium term for others. And there's other industrial subsectors where if it has any application, it's a long way off, right?
Yeah. Yeah, this is about as far as you could get from the fears that some might have, that this is some kind of protectionist sledgehammer looking to just smash away competition from overseas in a bunch of fat and lazy sectors of the Australian economy that ought to compete on the level playing field with the world or get out of business. This is actually very, very focused on only considering border adjustment, or any other measure for that matter, where it really makes sense, and doing so only to produce an actual policy level playing field. So giving imports the benefit of the same baselines that domestic production gets, not covering or adjusting for emissions that aren't actually covered within Australian policy. We don't cover Scope 2 emissions, the electricity sector, not meaningfully covered. So no adjusting for electricity-related emissions in imports. And you're right, going through all those activities, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of feedback from every sector covered as to whether they've been fairly assessed or not. But to my eye, on a first reading, those assessments look pretty fair. And certainly they've listened to what they've heard from those subsectors. There's some things in there that, I'm sure arguments will be had. Possibly the LNG people will come back saying, no, we are too sufficiently exposed that we need something. Because they do come off in the quantitative analysis as very slightly more exposed to leakage risk than some of the activities that are prioritised. But, of course, LNG is all exported. There's, as of today, no import competition, although that could be different in 18 months' time.
There are some really good tables that summarise all of the quantitative analysis that they've done, as well as some of the qualitative input that they're adding from stakeholder views and perceptions. I think it's really neatly done, and in a way for a carbon border adjustment layperson like myself to engage with. And so if you look at even just the overall summary, I think it's table 5, where they lay out the feasibility across the more significant candidates for a CBAM that they lay out. It's worth it. I don't even know if we've actually said that they're proposing an import-focused BOCA initially for a very narrow scope of materials, just clinker, cement and lime, which is much more narrow than Europe, which has got a whole bunch of they've got steel, aluminium as well. They've got quite a few commodities, and they go through how easy is this going to be? Are there commodity-specific considerations? Those 3 that we just said are relatively homogenous, so their supply chains are reasonably simple and straightforward, which makes some of the traceability work that is necessary. Is all domestic production covered under the safeguard, which lime isn't?
Yeah.
And so there's only 74% of lime domestic production that is covered under the safeguard mechanism. And then they talk about international considerations. So one other question I had the point on scope 2. I mean, that's sort of a broader conversation about more in terms of the market that we want to be driving overall is towards lower carbon embodied materials. And scope 2 is a very meaningful contributor.
It is.
So I think, not pretending that this mechanism is going to solve for that on its own, that this is doing part of the job, and that there needs to be, that it would complement things like guarantee of origin and things like that. But when you start to get to these commodities that aren't 100% covered by the safeguard mechanism, I wondered at their proposal of how you might deal with that. And to my mind, the most straightforward way they look at was suggesting that actually all domestic production of lime would be scooped into the safeguard to make this thing work.
Well, there's a sneaky sort of rumination in there about just lowering the safeguard mechanism thresholds, making everything a lot easier, right?
A little bit. That was the vibe of it, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So there would be some reason for caution, maybe the caution that makes you think twice but then do it anyway, but maybe caution that makes you genuinely pause about lowering the overall threshold for being covered by the safeguard. You do have this weirdness, and it's obvious in the within the cement sector, of some facilities over the threshold competing with other facilities within Australia under the threshold, not facing a direct carbon constraint. But if you lowered the threshold overall, you would bring in hundreds more facilities across a bunch of activities, some of which aren't even defined in the safeguard mechanism yet. And, there'd be a considerable amount of paperwork involved in that. But maybe you do it just for, at least initially, the tiddlers in the world of lime. For which you do have all the relevant definitions worked out already, and you do have a competitive anomaly already. That might be a good halfway house before getting to questions like, is there enough benefit overall from dropping, the generally applicable threshold from 100,000 tonnes a year of Scope 1 emissions for safeguard coverage to 50 or 25 or some number, versus the added administrative costs to set that up and to run it?
So if they don't deal with that, it's hard to see how this could work effectively, right? Like
for cement,
yeah. So, was there any other suggestion put forward? It was requiring importers to certify that imported products had come from a facility, emitting more than the safeguard baseline, which is just like, how would you implement that? I think that would be very hard.
An unpopular amount of paperwork, and also possibly quite circumventable indirectly. So not great. Or you could give a bonus to the baseline that imports get the benefit of, to reflect the fact that some of the Australian production isn't even covered at all. It doesn't sound great. Easier to bring in a few more players than make the whole thing more complicated than it needs to be.
Well, there is a degree to which the complexity is derived directly from the complexity inherent in the safeguard mechanism.
Yes.
A broadly applied carbon price is relatively easy to calculate. And there's less edge cases that one has to deal with if you're trying to, put in place a carbon border adjustment regime or a border carbon adjustment regime, or you're trying to adjust carbon at the border, whatever you're trying to do. It's simpler. Whereas if you've got a relatively complex baseline and credit scheme that applies differently to different subsectors of the economy, facility level sort of thresholds for inclusion or exclusion, like that's complicated. And so that complexity flows through to your carbon border adjustment regime, right?
Yeah, we are in a complicated place. And so some people might say to that, well, why make it even more complicated by adding this new thing on top? But one of the interesting things about a border adjustment for carbon at the border is that you can actually see it leading ultimately to a simplification and extension and perfection, or moving in the direction of being more perfect.
A more perfect union.
of carbon pricing mechanisms in Australia, because it highlights where there are gaps in the existing policy that would make sense to fill, and it suggests some other changes that would take it more in the direction of being a simpler and more flexible policy. For instance, they have some discussion in there of what is the revenue situation if you're doing border carbon adjustment at the border on carbon. And that comes about because in the current safeguard, complying entities, if they're not able to comply just by reducing their on-site emissions, they can purchase Australian carbon credit units or safeguard mechanism credits to bring themselves into compliance. What should an importer have to do? And it would actually be relatively complicated and demanding for importers to have to become entities that are allowed to deal financially in ACCUs within Australia. It might be nicer for them to just be able to pay a simple fee that's pegged in its unit price to the value of ACCUs within Australia. That is very much where the European equivalent discussion wound up, and also facing some arguments from people who had to buy units, like liable entities under the EU ETS, saying, should more people be buying these units that we need to buy? No, thank you. Have them buy something else. But if there's importers paying a fee to the Australian government at the border for carbon, that raises the question of, well, what do you do with that money? Because there's no other money being made by the Australian government off carbon. And secondly, making some public revenue off carbon, that's not the worst thing in the world. Maybe that might be a thing that could be done more broadly.
Is this CBAM, the gateway drug to carbon pricing more broadly in the Australian economy? You heard it here first. I liked where they landed with that suggestion. I mean, like, presumably Australian safeguard entities don't want more competition in the ACCU market, potentially driving up prices there. So the idea of keeping it simple and making it a fee makes a lot of sense. I did like their suggestion around how you might approach thinking about how you use that, and the kind of diplomatic lens that they bring to that is really nice as well. So if we're engaging in what would be viewed as more of a trade-aligned measure as well as a climate one, it could be invested into working with our trade partners on their own work and decarbonisation in those industrial sectors, or even on like this kind of mechanism, which I thought was really nice. Equally, I think they suggested it could be reinvested into our own domestic decarbonisation agenda as well. I thought that was really good food for thought. And but just on the admin side, though, while we're talking admin, and the threat of another government IT project. To someone who's sort of really engaging with this for the first time in a more sort of substantive way, this looks like a potential nightmare of a thing to administer. I'm waiting for you to calm my fears on that front. I mean, I think it's good that they're proposing that this would start incredibly narrowly on just a couple of commodities, but you'd have to set up this platform that was across every policy setting, you know, of every country that we import those commodities from. Maybe it's not that many in a meaningful sense. And I think you've also got to have settings in place to respect the sort of commercial confidentiality of some of those arrangements as well. I don't know if that stuck out to both of you, but it doesn't look like the simplest thing to get on with administering. And I think the narrow focus is one of the more important features, I'd say, in keeping it manageable.
They can just move all the boffins that are setting up vehicle efficiency standards. They can wrap up that project and move them on over to the carbon border adjustments for Borden at the carbon thing.
We solved it.
Those people might think they're about to escape, but no, their future has been determined for them. So there are a few things that you can do to make the administration here simpler. So one is that you just limit your ambition for what you are trying to cover to the things that matter and the things that you actually have a hope of being able to incorporate. So Scope 3 emissions beyond a very narrow set of things that are covered within the safeguard mechanism, don't try and do that. Don't try and get into, say, if we were to cover steel, don't try and get into, well, how was the iron ore mined that goes into the steel plant? You focus just on the Scope 1 emissions that are relatively easier to account for and to audit. A second thing that you do is you have the option of defaults available, default values for emissions intensity, and there's a bit of good discussion about the balance to be struck in this report between default values that are close enough to average actuals to be pretty fair, but are also high enough to provide a good incentive to importers to provide real data if they have the ability to gather that real data. And it's a delicate balance to try and strike, but the availability of a default means that if it's really hard for you to establish your bona fides, there is something that you can do that's very simple and have market access. And then the third thing is, and this is making life easier for the Australian government, potentially, rather than for importers, but you probably could just do what the Europeans are doing, which is in the first instance, you say, like, prove it. Declare your emissions at the border, provide, specify some kinds of information that are needed and some auditors who are credible, some methods that are accepted. And if the importer has the view that they've already paid for their carbon at home, show us the receipts. Tell us about this system. In some carbon pricing systems, actually all of the currently existing carbon pricing systems, producers of steel are given a very high share of the emissions rights that they need for free. It's pretty easy to determine whether a claimed carbon price has been paid in a country that's doing that, and to discount the carbon price that's said to have been paid accordingly. But if people have got better information, then show us the receipts. Doesn't sound fun to do like 1 10-ton shipment of steel at a time. But if you're doing an annual flow of thousands of tons from the same facilities, I think that's very solvable.
And they do talk about materiality thresholds, right? Like under a certain level, you wouldn't bother.
Yeah.
You'd need to be importing a certain volume of product for this to be picked up. And they're also quite optimistic about the prospect of international collaboration to establish some of these averages. You know, the approach being taken by the Australian government would be strengthened if it was using, default values for emissions intensity that were also referenced in other nations around the world that were adopting similar approaches. And it's also quite bullish on the prospect of Australia getting amongst it and actually helping to shape the evolution, the adoption of these sorts of regimes, noting that, to the degree Australia wants to become an exporter of clean economy stuff, the more that we can encourage and foster the development of these sorts of practices in other nations around the world, the more markets that will be demanding the kind of goods that we hope to be producing in 10, 15, 20, 30 years. So there's sort of a self-interested reason just from a simplifying the administrivia point of view, but also from, the developing the future markets for the things that we want to sell later this century.
Yeah, that's a really important point. A border adjustment that's non-discriminatory makes clean production more investable anywhere and everywhere. And the more markets like that, the better for would-be clean producers. And we're a would-be clean producer, and we can't just subsidise that stuff forever. There need to be markets where you can make clean stuff and make your money back if you're good at it.
Yeah, that was the other point I was going to make. I mean, that of course the government would have a strong interest in scaling up similar action around the world, because it would mean that some of the eye-watering production tax credits and things like that we're talking about now, which are necessary to get these industries up and running, there would be far less call for them into the future if you had these border adjustments up and running elsewhere.
Should we talk about the most sensitive part of this whole thing?
Well, I hear, Tennant, that this is just a great big new tax on everything.
Triggered.
Who told you?
Because, well, you're putting up the cost of production here in Australia, and you're actually making the cost of things we report more expensive as well. So ultimately, Australian businesses and households are going to pay through the nose, aren't they?
So this paper is, despite some very careful wording at times, it's not really very backwards in coming forward on the fact that, yes, product prices for covered goods will go up. Selling prices will go up for cement, say, if every potential supplier of cement is paying either costs at the margin for their emissions covered under the safeguard or costs under a border adjustment. What it does do, though, is show some receipts of its own on, well, what does that actually look like in practice? And what it looks like in practice is titchy, witchy, eeny, meeny, so absolutely tiny. Like for concrete, like steel, ammonium nitrate, fertiliser, a potential impact by 2030 in the realm of, and they've got some very good modelling health warnings on the use of any of these numbers, which maybe we'll go to, but in the realm of 0.1% to 0.4% of the product price might be the carbon price related uplift. And then if you I don't buy a lot of concrete a year myself, but if you think of this in terms of goods that people do buy, like houses, you're talking up to 0.01% of the construction cost might be the carbon-related uplift. Sort of similarly tiny numbers for like a wind farm construction. Wheat, I don't buy a lot of wheat. I do buy a decent amount of flour. Up to 0.1% of the wheat price, if the ammonium nitrate price has gone up, might be the carbon uplift. So it's just like it's a real effect that they're pointing to. It's just not one that would be like detectable amidst the noise of price movements, input cost movements, interest rate movements, wages movements, trade swings, etc. It's not exactly the GST.
No, I think, I mean, on the one hand, you're right. Like they really don't try to hide or mince words around the fact that this does allow the pass through of carbon costs on both sides. So it's sort of giving that transparency. But equally, they do go to some length to then give some very concrete examples about how much they expect that cost to factor in. Like I was waiting for how much is this going to impact the price of a house? And it's right there at a table for me. It's apparently $47.
I was just super disappointed that while they gave the uplift on a ton of wheat, they didn't then break it down into the ingredients of the cake.
Well, the cascading impacts of the wheat price input uplift, the cost of building the bakery and then the cost of a wind farm to power the bakery is all the way up to the dizzying heights of 3/5 of the level.
Which is kind of my point. Despite my best attempts to do a shock jock impersonation, I think it could be pretty hard to make that case. I, would not be shocked if someone tried to make it. But in reality, like the impacts on prices experienced by people in the real world are infinitesimal under this proposed policy. And so, there isn't a good faith argument one can really make for an end user cost impact. There may be other reasons that you're for it or against it, but I don't really think that should be one of them.
See, the one and there was a little bit of discussion about it to mine, goes to the different downstream products that use, like say different types of steel. I'm picking one example, but like some kinds of steel or commodities might be safeguard covered or not, but then they're, turned into other products and things like that. And so where you've got differentiated settings between products that at some point use, a commodity input that is or then isn't covered by a CBAM, like that might create some issues. And so I also wasn't sure, just from memory, that there were sort of concrete suggestions to how you would deal with that over time, besides potentially just making sure that Safeguard and then CBAM kind of covered those things.
Yeah, well, so there is a little bit of this in the European carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will apply not just to like piles of steel that are imported, but also to pipes and fittings of iron and steel, which are relatively simple and low value added products that they think would be meaningfully affected if the price of the steel in them went up. And you could have a similar approach in an Australian BOCA. You could either just treat some products as if they were the same as importing a ton of steel. And that would make sense on products that are very simple. When you start talking about products that are elaborate, like the example that people love to talk about is a car. Now, of course, we don't make cars in Australia anymore. And would you ever bother doing an adjustment for a product that you don't actually make? I would tend to say you'd have to have some other very good reason to do it. There's a lot of different inputs that go into a car. There's also a lot of value added in a car, and the different inputs, some of which are not emissions intensive, plus the value added, means that the final impact of is there a carbon price on it or not on the competitiveness of the final good is really diluted. That's not a bright line. That is a judgment call or let's set up a formula, and if your emissions intensity of the final product number is above a threshold, then okay, we'll look at whether the other conditions for this being practical to do an adjustment for are satisfied. I think that's where this winds up with an openness in principle to more products being covered, but a pretty tough set of conditions for actually covering them, at the core of which is, does it actually matter enough to go through all the bother of trying to do an adjustment? And for some things it would matter. I would guess like a wind tower, which is a giant chunk of steel. It's tough to make, but it's also a giant chunk of steel. That might well be one where you would do an adjustment. But a car or a high-end stainless steel pen, you'd never bother.
That makes sense.
So shall we talk a little bit about what's coming? Because there's effectively this whole paper is like, it's kind of the final paper. It's just they're throwing it over the side and seeing if it gets, machine gunned into smithereens. And there's a little string on it and they'll pull it back over. If they only got one or two sort of bullet holes in it, then they might actually put it out, right? Like, it's kind of the final paper. Like, the recommendations are here. The view of the review is kind of pretty clear on a lot of these matters. They might sharpen up some of the commentary and recommendations in the final paper. Also noting that they're saying they're going to have this done by the end of 2024.
Yes.
It's, as we record, the start of November. So there's not a lot of time to go away and think more deep thoughts off the back of the response to this.
Who knows what deep thoughts they've been thinking since mid-year, when this was all probably pretty close to ready to go.
I mean, there were very clear disclaimers throughout this document that this does not in any way represent government policy, and the government has not engaged with the recommendations in this review. So they're creating space for the what? I'm not going to use your analogy, Luke.
Very violent analogy. What do you think, Luke? The Australian climate policy debate is a peaceful and serene place, not one where people need violent metaphors. Shame on you.
Yes, I'm the true villain here. But I mean, I think those caveats will be in the final report as well, right? Because it's a review and it'll be going to government, then government will consider it. But I suppose if I look ahead, a review by the end of the year, a final document that can be perused. It's not clear to me whether it will be released by the end of the year, but it sounds like it's going to be in government hands by the end of the year.
To me, this looks like an opportunity for the affected sectors to have one more go at engaging and giving a view on whether they would support the model as it's outlined here. So, in or out, agree with the modelling that the sector's been subject to, and then I think the government would probably want a clear view about who the supporters would be and who the potential opponents would be, and of course that's going to factor into decision making potentially.
And we should say there's a characterisation of the broad view of different sectors throughout the document, right? Like there are some subsectors that are dealt with that are think some sort of CBAM for their sector would be a great idea, and others who aren't really on board. And I suppose that's useful information to convey back to the government. I guess I'm interested in this these sort of two horizons that the review foresees, which is a relatively quick implementation of some form of carbon border adjustment for 2 or 3 sectors, and then there's another tranche which they suggest be considered as part of the already scheduled 2026-27 review of the safeguard mechanism, right?
Yeah, that review's shaping up to be a doozy. There's nothing but fun questions to be considered in 2026-27 by the government of the day.
But presumably the inclusion of a fully functioning and bedded down carbon border adjustment mechanism and the prospect of it being expanded to other sectors may actually make some of the difficult questions around baseline decline rates beyond 2030 a little bit easier to grapple with, right?
Well, so like on the one hand, yes, I believe that the long-term design choices on the safeguard would be both hugely influenced one way or another, and I think have the opportunity to be greatly eased and improved by the presence of a border adjustment element. On the other hand, we are not going to have a fully bedded down and implemented border adjustment, even for cement, by July of 2026. The Europeans are years ahead of us, and they will only have recently started doing fiscal adjustments at the start of 2026. We have. I'm excited by what I'm about to say, but others may groan. We have years of design work ahead of us before we catch up to the Europeans.
That's fair. Let me amend my comments. Momentum towards a carbon border adjustment regime and some clarity around the design characteristics, I think would be helpful contextually for some of the hard conversations that are ahead of us later this decade.
Yeah, I agree with that. And like hard decisions in the imminent future, like what's Australia's 2035 emissions goal going to be? The safeguard isn't the only thing that is relevant to delivering that goal, but it's one of the more obvious dials to twiddle towards it. And a number of industries will be much less nervous about that dial twiddling if they're confident that the result will still be a level playing field for them to compete on.
Tennant, was it everything you hoped it would be? This special night we've shared together.
I've had a ball and it was so worth the wait. And I think this is fundamentally a very sensible paper. Like, of course, there's a couple of things in it I disagree with, but it's just quite reasonable, really, and addressing a question that needs actually a durable answer. If we're going to have ever stronger climate policy in this country, we need to be confident that that's compatible with having a strong economy and industries that we require the products of. And I think they're onto a winner.
You do you?
Yeah, it's, the jury was out. People wondered what the verdict would be. But look, I've come around on this whole CBAM thing. I think it's a good idea.
No, we're all shocked.
Shocker.
Yeah.
All right, that is our show for today. You can send in your thoughts on the carbon leakage review to mailbag@letmesumup.net. I'd be delighted to get some feedback on this episode. We also have a website. Tennant, what's there?
At www.letmesumup.net, you will find a large number of lesser episodes that don't mention the details of carbon border adjustment at all, but in their way are still pretty good.
Not that many.
There's really not that many, mate.
You work it into most episodes.
There's a lot of mentions, but there's no guts. But they are still pretty good. If you're interested in gas, in hydrogen, in emissions projections, in the world of energy, it's all there except for some special content. Not quite as special as this content, but still pretty special, which can be found somewhere else.
It can be found somewhere else. This podcast was edited by energy professional and podcast tragic Mark Spencer from Here Media Studio. Frankie, how do we pay for that editing?
We do that through the magnificent generosity of our super summer operas who support our Patreon over at patreon.com/letmesumup. You get access to subscriber-only episodes. I think Tennant would have been brokenhearted if we chose to put the CBAM behind the paywall. CBAM for all, I think, is...
it's a human right.
Written on his pillow or something. But also we have... maybe some draft designs for T-shirts floating around on the old Patreon.
They exist.
Climate-inspired pop culture. It's all there.
Yes. Patreon.com/letmesumup. But for now, for Frankie Maskovich and a very happy Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
It occurred to me that we're at this time of year when people start posting memes of Mariah Carey being unfrozen from large blocks of ice, and then her letting people know that it's time to start using All I Want for Christmas in your Spotify rotation. While I was up at 3 a.m. in the morning with a gastro-ridden child, I went to ChatGPT and I asked it to write a little song about CBAM to Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas. I'm not going to sing it though because it'd be terrible. But can I just read you like the chorus, like a couple of chorus lines, because it's so great.
I'm here for that.
I think on such an auspicious occasion, how could we possibly say no, Frankie?
I don't want a carbon fee just to keep the planet free. Make the polluters play their part so we can heal this earth so dear to heart. 'Cause all I want for climate's change is fair trade to rearrange. With carbon borders standing tall, we'll save our world. Let's change it all. Every nation must comply to lower emissions. We'll reach for the sky. When goods come in, they'll face the price. A greener future is our paradise.
Wow.
You're welcome.
Now, my question for you, Frankie, is, as perhaps a more regular customer of Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas than me, does that bear any resemblance in its structure or use of rhyming to the original?
Not really.
No. I've encountered this challenge.
Because I tried. Singing along that to music because I was going to do that for you on such an, as we've said, auspicious occasion, but I couldn't make that work. I still thought the lyrics were a bit fun and I wanted to read them to you.
I agree. I'm glad, though, that the last refuge of organic, handcrafted human labour looks like it will be the extremely silly but lyrically accurate rewording of previous songs that people know to be about climate stuff. That's something you can't take away from humans until the next version of ChatGPT.
That's right.